To hear this and many more audiobooks not available on YouTube in a podcast feed, please visit the first link in the description below, and thank you for your support. America Against America by Wang Huning. Chapter 6. Incomplete Campaign. Section 1. The Fight for the White House. The year 1988 was an election year. The quadrennial presidential campaign is the most exciting and lively part of political life. In each election, the two parties engage in a fight to the death for the White House and its occupancy. This presidential election saw the Democratic Party launch Massachusetts Governor Dukakis, and the Republican Party launch incumbent Vice President Bush. Both candidates and their vice presidential candidates are busy making campaign speeches and pulling votes. There is a powerful mechanism for running for office, and that is the voters' vote. If you do not get the votes of the voters, nothing can be done. Only when you get the majority of voters' votes, you can hold the power and enter the House. Attracted by this mechanism, candidates in general elections must first express their opinions on issues of public concern. In fact, there is no ideological difference between the two parties. There are only differences on basic and specific policies under the same ideology. One could say that the differences between them lie in what attitudes they hold on some commonly agreed issues. We can compare Dukakis's and Bush's views on some major issues according to American newspapers. Dukakis, foreign policy. Opposes aid to Nicaraguan Contras. Wants to strengthen economic sanctions against South Africa. Seeks more comprehensive embargo. Calls for strengthening strategic ties with Israel. Opposes any arms deal that could harm Israel's security. And encourages direct negotiations between Israel and Jordan. Advocating an international arms embargo on the Persian Gulf. International naval forces protect the right of freedom of the seas. Budget. Agree to increase income tax, but only as a last resort. Oppose reduction of capital gains tax. Support the single veto power. Willing to cut deficit, but no arguments. Says will maintain current military spending. Health protection. Support universal health insurance programs that require employers to pay for worker coverage. Want to increase AIDS research funds. Support directive testing for the military and for immigrants from countries with high rates of AIDS. Environment. Require the establishment of national standards to reduce the transmission of sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide, the main components of acid rain. Oppose oil extraction in important environmental protection areas and fish-producing areas. Oppose new commercial nuclear reactor stations. Address safety issues first. Employment. Called full employment the first goal. Wants to raise the minimum wage to $4.25 an hour. Arms control. Opposing the Star Wars program. Calls for negotiation of comprehensive nuclear test ban. Advocates negotiations to end testing and development of anti-satellite weapons. Social issues. Opposition to the death penalty. Supports $2.5 billion bill to distribute state funds to help poor and middle-income families. Oppose constitutional amendment to legalize abortion. Support federal funds. Support the right to own weapons. Drugs. Advocate for a cabinet-level committee to lead the entire anti-drug program. Will give more aid to foreign countries to help them prohibit drug production. Will aid governments willing to stop drugs from entering the United States. Promises more support for local anti-drug and rehabilitation programs. Education. Advocate for a national fund to recruit teachers. Companies will be encouraged to have employees work in teaching units for 3 to 5 years. Support the re-employment of retirees with expertise. Education investment program to be established to enable college students to repay tuition loans. A college opportunity fund will be established, and the government will guarantee tuition if parents provide funds for their children's education. Bush. Foreign policy. Agrees to provide military and humanitarian assistance to the Nicaraguan Contras. Opposition to further sanctions against South Africa. The United States should be the broker in the Middle East and facilitate negotiations, but then impose conditions to never abandon Israel. Budget. Promise not to increase income taxes under any circumstances. Want to reduce capital gains tax to 15% from 28%. Agree to the single veto right. Requires flexibility to freeze but refuses to say what programs will be cut. Health protection. Wants to eliminate the activities of the Transformation of Life Insurance, IRA, to implement long-term protection plans. Suggestions to promote the purchase of group insurance plans. In favor of local AIDS control education. In favor of AIDS testing for prisoners, immigrants. Environment. Want to develop coal washing process to reduce acid rain. Support for the construction of nuclear reactor stations. Employment. Requirement to create 30 million jobs in 8 years, later deemed too optimistic. Opposition to minimum wage increase. Arms control. Support Star Wars research. Support space experiments. Opposition to the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Support the testing and development of anti-satellite weapons. Social issues. In favor of the death penalty. Opposes federal relief. Favors establishing a new $10 million tax credit for each child of a family earning less than $20,000 per year. Oppose federal gun registration and licensing. Favor loosening gun control laws. Drugs. Advocate for a cabinet-level meeting to lead anti-drug operations. Advocating for the death penalty for drug-related crimes. Advocate for a meeting of Latin American countries on how to end economic dependence on drugs. Advocates legislation to confiscate driver's licenses and federal student loans from repeat offenders. Education. $500 million fund planned to fix high schools that advance student education. Require more tests for students and more proficiency tests for teachers. A college savings bond program will be established, with tax exemptions if profits are used for colleges and universities. From the above comparison, we can see that the candidates of both parties care about and discuss the issues that are of concern to the general public. Talking around these issues is precisely to win voters. The above 9 areas are all issues that are discussed daily in academia, the press, politics, and the public. Budget, health, environment, jobs, drugs, education, etc. are all headaches. A party's presidential candidate will have to think of solutions to these issues. In fact, each candidate does not know if they can solve them, and in order to be elected, they must provide solutions. In fact, these solutions have been available to society for a long time, and there are multiple solutions. The job of both parties is simply to choose the option that is likely to have the most support or sympathy as their own. It can also be said that choice is not a very accurate word. In terms of political parties, this is putting a commodity, the candidate, on the market. In terms of voters, this is shopping among the commodities available in the market. As a result, elections develop a strange logic, whether parties choose voters or voters choose parties. In many cases, presumably, parties choose voters. The result is that parties do not have a unified platform. Party members can be indecisive and voters can be left and right. This is the power of elections. See Chapter 5, Section 1, The Donkey and the Elephant Rule the Country. In fact, whether a political party can achieve its platform after being elected and whether it is willing to achieve its platform can be checked during the election campaign. By the time it can be checked, the party has already been elected and is again beyond control. At best, the losing party can wait until the next round and then the above phenomenon may happen again. In the election campaign, all you need to do is talk the talk. This phenomenon has been much studied by scholars. Another is to see the election as a referendum of the previous administration's performance in order to decide whether to replace it. The idea here is to replace the person, not how to do the job after the new person comes in. Anyway, whatever can be done to win the White House and the presidency, so be it. This logic requires a high degree of political flexibility and agility to become a barometer of the demands of society. Otherwise, it is impossible to get into the White House. Section 2. The Path of the President. In late October 1988, the presidential election was in full swing. The Democratic and Republican candidates for president and vice president had already debated 3 times on television, and the results of various polls were flooding television screens. The presidential candidates were touring the states, and in a few weeks the presidential election would be held. The President of the United States can be considered the most powerful head of government and head of state in the world. He is backed by the great power of the United States and can often generate policies to turn the tide of history. One can feel it as soon as one listens to the presidential candidates' speeches, each claiming how he will keep the U.S. number 1 in the world. Nixon's new book, popularly titled 1999, Winning Without War, has something to say about the mindset of those who have sat on the presidential throne. Quote, "Peace and freedom cannot exist without the United States playing a central role in the international community. It is a simple fact that, as Andre Malraux once told me, America is the first nation in history to become a world power without deliberately seeking world power status. However, if we cannot lead the free world, there will be no free world that can be led." End quote. This grand statement, I fear, cannot be made without a particularly good sense of self. Where did the president come from? It may seem like a strange question. In a political system like the United States, the president is elected by the voters, and anyone who gets the voters' vote can walk into the Oval Office of the White House. In fact, the voters also vote in real terms, choosing between the Democratic and Republican candidates. The person who doesn't get the majority of the votes doesn't become president. However, it would be a mistake to infer from this that it is possible for anyone to become the president. In the abstract, every citizen has the potential to become president if he or she meets the requirements. Specifically, in the 200 years since the country was founded, only about 40 people have had that luck. Others can have dreams of being president, but that's about it. The mechanism for producing the president has come a long way since the day the nation officially voted. This mechanism, although informal, is a central part of political life. In fact, candidates from smaller parties often fall through the cracks and no one knows about them. I'm afraid that after a little bit of noise and fuss, there will be only a little more name recognition, but probably not much else. Only the Republican and Democratic candidates have the last word, so to be president, you first have to get the nomination of one of the parties. This excludes a large number of people, and within both parties there is a small number of people who can be nominated. A small group of people from both parties make up the caucuses. The caucuses nominate candidates for various public offices, such as governor, state offices, and the presidency, although there are different levels of caucuses, with state offices generally nominated by a caucus composed of the backbone of the state legislature. At the national level, the caucus nominates presidential candidates. The caucus is crucial, and the caucus for the 1988 election was held in Iowa. After the caucus, there is a primary election. Primaries are actually intra-party elections that take place at the party convention. Convention delegates are chosen by state and local party organizations and are more representative than the caucus. The caucus determines a certain number of candidates, all from the same party. The party convention then selects the most suitable of these candidates to be the party's candidate in the official election. A look at the process makes it clear that the average person is unlikely to get the nomination. Only the intended candidates of both parties have this blessing. However, another thing to know here is that the management and organization of the candidates in the election process is actually taken up by the parties, not by the government. The two parties limit the possible number of candidates, a mechanism that must be in place for any democratic election. The job is a tricky one, and the government cannot do it if there is no organization in society to do it. It would necessarily be against democratic principles for the government to do it. It is important for a democratic society to consider what mechanisms should be in place to achieve this function. The conventions of both parties are major events in political life. Hundreds of activists gather, and television stations broadcast them live. The party conventions do 2 things. They present the party platform, and they choose the presidential nominee. Voters can only choose on the basis of their candidate's choice. The delegates to the convention are crucial. The way they are elected varies from state to state. Some states elect delegates, some have some discretionary power, some have unrestricted self-determination, some have certain delegates elected by voters, and some delegates appointed by county and state party organizations. If you want to be nominated, you must first influence the creation of delegates to the nominating convention. The diversity of delegate generation mechanisms is consistent with the diversity of the political system, which is a hallmark of the United States. Not just anyone can be a delegate. Delegates are generally officials, members of Congress, governors, mayors, members of state legislatures, in short, party dignitaries. Ordinary people can only look forward to being a delegate. The delegate's duty is to decide what to put forward for the voters to choose. The conventions of both parties determine a total of 2 people, 1 from each party. The voters will actually choose one of these 2 people in the future, but of course there will be some non-party candidates in different places, but they will not make it to the national level. The presidential campaign battle begins after both parties have chosen their candidates. This process reflects American-style democracy, but it is a democratic campaign of 2 or at most 4 people. That is why it is an imperfect campaign, just as the concept of imperfect competition is used in economics. I'm afraid that this latter layer of democracy would not have been possible without the previous, less democratic activities of both parties. Imagine what would have happened if hundreds of candidates had participated in a national campaign. Candidates from both parties would be running around giving speeches and winning the hearts and minds of the people. This party ring is very important because their election depends on the voters' vote. This ring is indeed the real deal. Voters don't have too much choice, but for those people, it is enough to choose one or the other. Voters do not directly elect the president when they cast their ballots, but rather elect the Electoral College, EC. Each state has a certain number of votes equal to the number of representatives the state has in Congress, such as 47 in California and 8 in Iowa. Whichever candidate for president has the majority in a state, all the votes in that state belong to him. And big states are especially important, as are states with large populations. That's why the second debate between Bush and Dukakis in 1988 was held in Los Angeles, California, against 47 votes there. California plus New York had 83 votes, and 270 votes were needed to get elected. Voters in each state elect the members of the Electoral College who are elected by state party conventions, party committees, or other means. These electors must support the party's official presidential candidate. Voters do not elect the president on election day. They elect these electors. Only the voters represented by the majority of electors have the opportunity to express their will. The will of the rest of the electorate is forced on them by the majority of electors. On the first Monday, after the second Wednesday, in December, the winning electors meet in the state capitals to hand in their election certificates and register. In fact, this is already a walk in the park, because once the electors are chosen, the situation is clear, and it is already clear who will be elected as the next president. Another difficulty for the average person to become a presidential candidate is the cost of campaigning. The cost of campaigning has reached a staggering number of dollars. In 1972, it was officially announced at $10 million, but unofficially, we won't get into that. And what it was in 1988 was not yet announced. Money beyond a certain limit is the same for the average person. Impossible to get. The usual sources of expenses for presidential candidates are donations and gifts. Of course, those who give have their own intentions, and those who receive understand them. Rockefeller alone spent more than $3 million on various expenses for his campaign. How can ordinary people enjoy this kind of democracy? My analysis here is intended not to talk about a dysfunctional political system, but to point out just how far democracy can unfold in order to end up with a single political leader who can manage a large society. Our analysis of American democracy demonstrates this conundrum. Political and social management requires a centralized process. If it were completely and utterly democratic, the United States would not even be able to elect a president, I'm afraid. Political parties in the United States play a centralizing role outside the formal system. They actually centralize opinion in a less than democratic way. The voter's choice follows this centralization process and is a second hand. Why does such a process still have the appearance of a democracy? I think there are two things. For one thing, American political parties operate and are organized in ways that are outside the political system. They cannot use the state or government agencies to achieve their programs. But the fact that they are outside the political system prevents their activities from being formally counted as part of the political system. This part of the more centralized political activity is done in an informal process in the context of social activities. Political parties control politics by means of getting presidential candidates and various candidates elected. Once elected, they can use the legal process to achieve their will. Every society needs two aspects of political activity: a more centralized process to produce political leadership and a more democratic process to lead politics. It is the latter activity that the American political system copes with. The former activity is determined by political parties. Second, a more programmatic process of operation has also developed within the U.S. political parties. Not exactly the same for the Democratic and Republican parties. There is some leeway in the various conventions and meetings, although they are controlled by core party figures. At the party conventions, there are contests between different candidates from the same party. This process not only effectively disguises the final manifestation of centralization, the right to make the final decision, but also finds a way to resolve intra-party conflicts. For the American political parties, I will make a separate analysis. There's a wonderful thing about the American political system. You can't say it's undemocratic, and you can't say it's democratic. That's why I say that the U.S. elections are not fully contested. Section 3. 2nd District Democratic Party Gathering. After we have divided the macro activities of political parties in the whole election, we have a concept of the role of political parties in political life. In fact, the activities of political parties cannot be separated from their grassroots organizations. Without the active and effective activities of subordinate organizations at all levels, a political party will become an empty shell. Over the weekend, with 2 days off, and no one working on Saturday and Sunday, it is popular to say, "Have a good weekend," on Friday. This is a way of life reflected in human relations. Probably the primitive people, when meeting and parting, said, "Shoot a rabbit." On September 16, 1988, at the University of Iowa Activity Center, I ran into several college students doing election campaigning for Democratic candidate Dukakis and local candidates. A small table was set up in front of the cafeteria with 2 girls and 1 young man. The 2 girls seemed very shy, not at all political. The young man, on the other hand, was very active and was happy to hear that I was a professor of political science and wanted to learn about how local politics works. I was immediately invited to the 2nd District Democratic Party potluck or picnic that was held over the weekend. The invitation, of course, was not free, but a levy, since the main purpose of such gatherings is to raise money for the candidates. Around 5 p.m., we arrived at the venue, which was located just outside of Iowa City. The venue was located in a relatively calm place, either a farm or a park. It was a simple setup with a large house, somewhat like the auditorium I had in my cadet school labor days, only with a floor and a large wood-paneled shed outside. There were 2 young men selling drinks in the shed, as the purpose of such meetings themselves is to raise funds, and it is impossible to provide a lot of free drinks. Next to them were some young girls selling t-shirts with campaign slogans or candidates' names on them, as a means of publicity. There was also a Polaroid camera, where a cardboard cutout of Democratic presidential candidate Dukakis stood, exactly like the real person. You can go up and stand next to it and take a picture, which is quite realistic. The main method of fundraising is by paying a meal fee. The food fee is high, $8 for a single person, $24 for a family, and $6 for a child. It was a case of the ginger fisherman will take the bait. Most of the people who came were Democratic Party activists, so they were willing to donate money. In fact, these activists are also dependent on the Democratic Party. They include congressmen, senators, state representatives, state senators, and various local prominent figures. They cannot be elected to these positions without the support of the Democratic Party, so they are naturally very enthusiastic, and I am afraid they cannot help but be enthusiastic about Democratic Party activities. This has become a network or relationship. Without this network, a person would lose many resources. It is reasonable to say that in such a society, where individualism and private domains are prized, people will not care about this. In fact, I found that people care a lot. People who are not part of these networks are trying to get in, and some people are coming here with bad intentions. Important figures of the local Democratic Party were present. Such gatherings are also important to these figures themselves. There is a strange interplay between the need for these people to be present at such gatherings and the need for these people to be present at such meetings as part of their obligation and as part of their own public image. Among the people who came, the high-ranking one was a congressman named Nagel, who wore an apple green t-shirt and went around greeting people, looking easygoing and dashing. There was another candidate for governor of Iowa, a Democrat, tall, wearing glasses, quite scholarly, named Kristall, walking around. I went over to talk to him, and he was very easygoing, and asked me what I thought about the fate of Gorbachev's reforms. I said that Gorbachev was facing many difficulties. He said that the Soviet system was solid and not easy to change. As a local person, it is not easy to be so concerned about international issues in the United States. The international perspective of local people in the United States is weak and does not match the status of the United States as a great power. I became interested in him after this conversation. John Kristall, the son of an Iowa farmer, received a degree in economics from the University of Iowa in 1949, ran a farm from 1949 to 1959, turned to banking in 1959, and was president of the Iowa Savings Bank from 1960 to 1984. He was chairman of the Iowa State Savings Bank from 1960 to 1984 and president of the State Bankers Association in 1973. In 1987, he was named Iowa's Farm Leader of the Year. Since 1956, he has been active in Democratic Party politics. The literature also states that he has been the most respected advisor on Soviet issues for over 25 years. How he came to have this last ability is not clear to me. It seems from his experience that it was entirely business-oriented and political. Many politicians are not professional politicians. Most of them take political positions when necessary. President Carter was a peanut grower. President Reagan was an actor. From the top national leaders to small municipal public officials, it's all the same. I'm afraid this is also a characteristic of politics. This format allows most public officials to have a backup plan, and no special arrangements need to be made for them. Perhaps more importantly, these people bring their long-standing business mindset and social skills to government, making it particularly adept at dealing with economic issues and social development. Local government is not so much political as it is like a large corporation dealing with various social matters. Kristall has a good economic experience, which is a necessary condition to enter politics. I also met State Senator Jane, whom I had interviewed in 1987 about the status and function of the state senate. She was handing out fans with her name on them, also a form of public relations. Such occasions, of course, are important and critical, and one should be there to make an appearance. I also met some of the Democratic Party leaders in the county. Carrie Bowen, Nagel's representative in this county, joked to me that if I went to a Republican potluck, not to tell them what was going on here. Thus, we can find that both parties, though loosely organized and disciplined as they are, have a relatively good top-down approach to their activities. Although the activities of the lower-level organizations have little to no ideological line guiding them from the top, and are solely for the purpose of canvassing votes in their own constituencies, and possibly only for people of the same party in their own constituencies running for state or local office, and not exclusively for national presidential candidates. But such activities reinforce the congregation's identification with a party, whether Democratic or Republican. The status of a political party is established more in the minds of the people, so it can be said that the concept of a party is political as well as cultural and psychological. One of the key things that makes the national systems of both parties seem effective is that they have very large and active grassroots systems. What holds this whole system together is the structure of interests. In fact, the parties do not have very clear national interests, and the platforms proposed by the parties in the presidential election are indeed supported by the states because of their beliefs and value choices, not because they reflect the specific interests of the states. Each state and each party organization has its own interests and values, some very different, and they defend and pursue their own interests under the banner of both parties, and the national party organizations are happy to let them do so, which ensures some form of centripetal force. Through their activities, party organizations at the state and local levels realize the intentions and interests of local power players. This process has the peculiar effect of actually strengthening the party's national coalition, even though local party organizations are mostly concerned only with their own interests. This is a major feature of the party system. Section 4. TV debates. The 1988 presidential election, as in the past, was tight and very lively. Democratic presidential candidate Dukakis, Republican candidate George W. Bush. The two opponents made campaign speeches and activities everywhere. Every day, there was a new twist, a shot in the arm to win over voters. Their platform arguments I described earlier. See Chapter 6, Section 1, Race for the White House. What is actually important in such campaigns is not that voters understand their political platforms. The United States has a sufficiently developed mass media, so it is not difficult for anyone to understand their political views. The fundamental purpose of such activities is to expand their influence, build up their image, contact the public's feelings, and grow their power. Today, voters are less concerned with political platforms and more concerned with the personalities, abilities, and images of presidential candidates. One college professor told me he didn't like Bush, and when I asked why, he replied, "Bush's face looks unreliable. Dukakis is much more reliable." What kind of criteria is that? A high point of the 1988 election was the televised debate between Bush and Dukakis on the evening of September 25th, to be broadcast live on television to a national audience for 90 minutes. Many people were interested in this debate. Professors in the political science department at the University of Iowa have been talking about it for a long time, perhaps because of their profession. Of course, there were many who ignored it. Afterwards, some footage was shown on television, and reporters interviewed several pedestrians on the street who said they hadn't been paying attention and hadn't watched. The political science professors had a picnic that afternoon. When it was about time, everyone drove home and waited for the debate. I was watching the telecast at a professor's house. His wife, a laser technician, was also sitting there in silence. His son, an elementary school student, also seemed interested and watched until the end, when the debate began at 7 o'clock. There were two opposing podiums, one for Bush and one for Dukakis, and in front of them sat 4 TV presenters, senior journalists, of course, to ask questions. In the back was a large venue with about a couple hundred people sitting down. In front of the announcer's table there were red and green lights to indicate speaker time. The announcers had their backs to the audience opposite the speaker's order. While they sat, the two prominent candidates stood. The procedure is roughly as follows. One reporter asks a question to one of the candidates, then the candidate answers, and after the answer, the other candidate comments, which is actually a rebuttal. Both sides get roughly equal numbers of questions. The debate was, shall we say, heated. Bush had said during the debate, "I wish it was a less friendly night." Both sides debated taxes, deficits, education, drugs, abortion, armaments, and international relations. The content was largely a reiteration of the insights they have expressed on these issues on various occasions, and because it was a live exchange, there was always a bit of wit and humor on display. Right off the bat, Dukakis said if he could do that, he'd be the Joe Isuzu of American politics, insinuating that Bush was like a TV advertiser selling doggy pills, which got a good laugh from the audience. Soon after, Bush also made a brilliant remark saying, "This answer is as clear as Boston Harbor." Boston is the state capital of Massachusetts, which is heavily polluted, and Dukakis is the governor there, and Bush meant that what Dukakis said wasn't clear. There were also some tit-for-tat exchanges between the two sides. Dukakis said, "I want to make sure never to deal with the dictator of Panama," referring here to Noriega. Bush said, "All 7 administrations dealt with Noriega, but the Reagan-Bush administration brought him to justice." Dukakis said, to most people, the notion of President Quayle is terrifying." Quayle was Bush's vice presidential candidate. Bush said, "He's done a great job." Dukakis said, "Obviously the vice president is doubting my patriotism. I love this country. I believe in it." Bush said, "I don't doubt your patriotism, but can we make the country that left-wing? He's that left-wing and to the left of mainstream America." The entire debate lasted 90 minutes, with occasional applause and laughter from the floor. The two candidates also made mistakes because of the tension. Bush once referred to himself as president instead of vice president. Dukakis also made a mistake once, causing laughter. Bush was so sophisticated that he couldn't remember the name of a defense system halfway through his speech, and said, "Only icemen never make mistakes." After a while, the moderator miscalculated the time. The time has not arrived to let Bush stop speaking. Bush spoke up in defense. The moderator said, "Sorry, I was wrong. You said everyone will make mistakes." The two sides in the debate are using their brains. Bush called Dukakis the governor of Massachusetts, trying to create the impression that Dukakis is just a local official, and Dukakis called Bush Mr. Bush or George, avoiding mentioning the title of vice president. These aspects weigh heavier than the substantive physical appearance in the debates, which largely determines whether the candidates can conquer the voters psychologically. In addition to this, both sides paid special attention to image. Newspaper comments said that both candidates were successful in language, tone, and style. Both are longtime politicians, so they can naturally speak well. The first requirement to be a politician in the United States is to be able to speak. The costumes were also carefully planned. Frank Greer, Dukakis' campaign advisor, said that to ensure an elegant image, Dukakis brought several shirts and several ties to be on camera. Dukakis wore a blue and gray suit, white shirt, and red tie, as did Bush. The American concept is that the image of politicians is not a personal issue, but a matter of whether the people have confidence in them, so they are very image conscious. After the debate, there was a flurry of commentary from all walks of life. Some said Bush won, others said Dukakis won. People made comments with a lot of emotion, saying whoever they supported was good. Reporters interviewed members of each candidate's campaign team on the spot and all said they were good. NBC: it's hard to say who lost or who won. ABC: both are very good, but Dukakis is slightly better, so maybe he wins. CBS: nothing new. If there's a winner, Dukakis is slightly better. CNN: George Bush wins. Also, there was an immediate poll to see who scored more points. My impression is that the two men are about the same, but Bush is more seasoned, has experience in international politics, and has insight into national politics, and Dukakis is slightly worse in that regard, but Dukakis has an advantage because the public has high expectations of Bush, and he just has to be able to handle Bush, and doesn't need to have a clear upper hand to deliver. This procedure is very interesting and has a high degree of openness. Such debates are an example. The election of the top executive head can be debated openly, making it a truly public affair, even though the candidates have strong party affiliations that the common people have no access to. Of course, ordinary people can join the party and volunteer to work for the party's candidate, campaigning, canvassing, donating, etc., but if they want to win, they have to engage in public relations. The nature of the U.S. political system prompts various political groups and parties to pursue this kind of publicity, or else they cannot get elected. When it comes to expanding publicity, societies have two kinds of motivation. One comes from the party that wants to win, and the other comes from the public. In a number of societies, the demand for greater publicity tends to come from the latter. The material abundance of society has led most people to stop paying attention to abstract political principles or whatever programs. They want to have an emotional understanding of a politician. The system, in turn, encourages people to do this. Anyone who wants to be in this office must get the vote, and without the vote, there is nothing to talk about. The power of the vote pushes them to find ways to be as public as possible. The candidates lobby around, make gestures, go on TV for the same reason. Part of what makes Quill so unsettling is that he is too young and probably too junior. For some, it's always a little unsettling to leave public affairs to someone like this, and many people think so. In fact, Americans are not interested in politics, but in how the person is, which is called the depoliticization of politics. This debate format also provides the public with a better understanding of the candidates. For a long time, adult citizens had the right to vote, but the voters never knew who was elected, how they were, what they were like, what they were good at, what they stood for, and the votes were cast and there was no democracy. An important criterion of democracy is a well-informed choice. Of course, it is difficult to do this, and the United States does not do it 100% of the time. Section 5. Dreams of a Congressman. Elections for members of the House of Representatives are held at the same time as the presidential election. On Election Day, November 8th, in 1988, voters will elect members of the House of Representatives and the President at the same time, so the election of members of Congress is ramping up at the same time as the presidential election is taking place. I contacted the Republican Party headquarters in Iowa City's county and asked to observe the congressional races, and the headquarters staff was kind enough to let me shadow Republican candidate Don Redfern and watch him campaign in Iowa City. Elections to Congress are held by electoral districts. The districts are divided according to the total population, and each district has an equal number of people. Each district elects one member of the House of Representatives, so each member represents an equal number of people. Each district includes approximately one or more counties. The situation varies in large cities. Iowa is an agricultural state with a small population, so the geographic range of districts is larger. Both parties have campaign headquarters in each district. The district in which Iowa City is located is the 3rd congressional district. Under the district headquarters, there are county headquarters. The so-called headquarters is actually a space rented by both parties with 1 or 2 staff members. The Republican Party's headquarters in Iowa City is on a 2-story building, and the place is not small, with a space for 24 chairs to make speeches. There were 2 or 3 staff members, 1 girl was a permanent staff member, and the others came to work on a volunteer basis. The headquarters was responsible for arranging the activities of the party's candidate in the county. One of Mr. Redfern's activities was a private dinner with the district's entrepreneurs. The entrepreneurs of the district are the local elite or gentry. They have a club for their own activities. Every Tuesday morning they meet for breakfast, usually to exchange information, talk business, and invite people to give speeches. This is the local power group. If a person wants to win a local election, he or she must first win this power. Breakfast began at 7 a.m. And after a few minutes of eating, Redfern gave a speech that covered his views on U.S., domestic and foreign affairs. Essentially his same old stuff. He is a Republican candidate, so many of his views are similar to those of Republican presidential candidate George W. Bush. After his talk, the breakfast attendees asked questions, and Redfern answered them all. The entrepreneurs then played a game, handing out a small piece of paper to each of them and asking them to mock vote, which resulted in 18 votes for Bush and 2 for Dukakis. Naturally, since Redfern is a Republican, it would have been a lot different if a Democrat had given the speech. It was almost 8 when the entrepreneurs left the room, and by 8, only 4 remained. The breakfast was over. Entrepreneurs have an organization of entrepreneurs, and anyone who wants to join in an election cannot do so without pulling together this group. Being a candidate is very hard. There's a lot of running around and doing a lot of things throughout the day. Redfern drove 250 miles to Iowa City at noon to attend an afternoon event. The first activity was a trip to the University of Iowa's teaching hospital. The teaching hospital at the University of Iowa is nationally known as a well-equipped and highly skilled medical facility. Redfern drove himself there, and I sat in his car with an American professor, without anyone in front or behind me. When we arrived at the hospital, we were led to a meeting place, where there were 16 to 18 people, 5 of whom were with him, including us, 7 from the press, and the rest from the hospital. The crowd was surprisingly small, but Redfern didn't seem to care, giving his usual lively speech about his basic views on U.S. domestic and foreign policy, then asking questions and closing, leaving 20 minutes for him to receive the reporters present one by one. Each could ask a few questions. So it doesn't matter how few people there are. The important thing is that thousands of people know about him through newspapers, TV, and radio. In the United States, the hardest thing is to find an audience. Professors come to universities to give lectures, and it is not easy to find an audience. A candidate for Congress doesn't seem to have much appeal. This is a very interesting phenomenon in American politics. Anyone who wants to get into politics has to ask the voters, not the voters having to ask them. After leaving the hospital, the same car went to a student residence, where he was going to meet the students. Once there, Redfern's main activity would have been to stand in front of the student cafeteria shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with the students. He stood in the doorway for a while, met the students and said, "Hi, I'm Don Redfern, a candidate for Congress," then asked the students if they are going to vote or something like that, purely for networking. It's an extremely difficult job, and the students don't seem to be interested in it, usually just saying hi and passing on, and few are willing to say more, and some are extremely cold. I looked around and saw how hard it was to be a candidate for Congress. There was no one in front or behind. There were 3 of us, him, his assistant, and me. This is American politics. His opponent is David Nagel, Democrat. Nagel is currently the congressman for his district, and is seeking re-election. Nagel has also been active on campus a number of times, giving speeches and such. Redfern didn't seem too interested in the event, doing it for a while before heading to his next stop, telling his aides in a depressed mood, "Let's go. I'm not feeling well." And so it was. The next stop was also a student dormitory building called Mayflower. The International Pen Center, famous in China, is located in that building. We drove ourselves there, were greeted by a female student, and were led to a meeting room with nearly 20 students. Redfern spoke for 40 minutes all about his views on domestic and foreign affairs, but with a focus on education. After the lecture, the students asked questions about Social Security, education, and other issues. After the questions, it was over, an hour before and after, and there were not many people here. Outside the meeting room was the student activity room, where a number of people were playing video games, billiards, and ping pong, and some were watching TV. None of them were fascinated by the speech of a congressional candidate and did their own thing. That was the end of the day's activities. Redfern drove me back to school. In the car, we discussed the process of creating candidates for Congress. Candidates for Congress are elected by a constituency. One can run if he or she feels capable of running, but only with the approval of a certain number of people. First, you have to go through a primary election, and after that, you can become a candidate. The primaries are held among the party's aspiring electors. Redfern won the primary and became the Republican candidate. The Republican Party supported his campaign, including giving him the funding allowed by law and other support. He said the party's support was very important and that without it the campaign would have been difficult to win. In fact, in American politics, candidates have real competition in the primaries, but the party's primaries already exclude others. After the primaries, only the candidates of the two major parties have the possibility of being elected, and it is actually a competition between the two of them. The two-party system effectively makes the candidates clean, a function that the government has no way of assuming. Because there is competition among the parties, it is possible to tolerate dissent. This does not lead to internal division. Those who disagree are voted out and do not have a lot of grievances or grudges against anyone. This mechanism appears to benefit the social management system. Another point worth noting is that high-level elections like Congress are not as attractive and inspiring, and most people seem to be indifferent. This is an important, though not ideal, condition of democracy. Democracy will not function maturely if everyone has a strong interest in politics. It has been said that the greatest enemy of democracy is not tyranny, but democracy itself. Politics in the United States rarely directly affects the daily lives of voters except in the case of taxes, so it is not difficult to understand the indifference of voters. This situation forces each candidate to do everything possible to travel, speak, and rally to make themselves known to the voters. This mechanism forces the two parties to come up with decent candidates in terms of appearance, character, eloquence, knowledge, associations, social interaction, etc. All must be able to take the stage, otherwise there is no way to appeal to the voters. Take Redfern, a lawyer himself, with a lot of experience, good looks, excellent diction, a good sense of humor, and good with people. Nagel probably has the same qualities. The electoral system coupled with the party system makes for a high-quality candidate. Either of these two, without either, could produce ludicrous results. Redfern's campaign was run by himself, and not many people worked for him. He talked about specific issues of concern to the people, not because the candidate was willing to talk, but because of the power of the electoral mechanism. Naturally, there is another force that is more important, and that is the political parties. It is difficult for ordinary people without political party background to win in the election. Section 6. Election Day. November 9th is Election Day in the 1988 election year, when nearly a year of intense campaigning comes to a close with voters casting their ballots to decide who will be president, as well as for members of the House of Representatives, some senators, and some state governors. Elections, including those for some county officials, are held on the same day. This will eliminate the need to spend more time on the various elections. Prior to Election Day, each voter is required to register. If you do not register within a certain period of time before the election, you cannot vote. Registration may or may not indicate whether the voter is registered as a Republican or a Democrat. The election is managed by a special agency of the county government, and the list of all voters is entered into a computer and divided into precincts. The data entered is a voter's name, social security number, address, etc. The campaigns push voters to register them as voters of their own party. Starts long before Election Day. There is often a booth set up by pro-party students in schools, asking you to register. Of course, you can also register at the headquarters or at the election agency. Each party's headquarters also has a roster of people registered as voters for their party. When Election Day is approaching, they start to work on the lists. Party workers in the constituency also have to contact their party's voters. In the past, they used to go to each house, but now they usually use the telephone method. Those who have volunteered to work on the campaign in the party headquarters also have to start their activities, such as distributing propaganda materials. On Election Day, polling stations were set up in each precinct. Voters drove themselves to the polls, and I made an observation at one polling station. Voters came in large numbers and seemed to have a sense of responsibility. It is impossible to drive yourself for 10 minutes, stand in line, and then vote without a certain perception governing it. This perception constitutes an important condition for the political system to function and remain unchanged for 200 years. If everyone is not interested in voting, that is, in maintaining an institution, how can such an institution exist? Naturally, the development of material conditions is to some extent also a condition for citizen participation. Families have cars, and it is easy to come and go, especially in the countryside. However, compared to some Western European countries, there are some inconveniences in U.S. elections, e.g., pre-election registration, no public holiday for elections, time limits on residency. Low voter turnout is often thought to be related to this. At the polling station, voters fill out a small form with their name, address, and social security number. Then it goes to another worker who finds a record of the voter's registration on a roster typed up by the computer. The voter signs in, indicating that the voter has come to vote, and then goes to a third person to receive the ballot. The ballot is a long strip of paper about 40 centimeters long and 15 centimeters wide. The ballot varies from state to state. The names of the candidates are printed on it with the first column for either the Democrat or the Republican. If the voter wants to vote for all the candidates, just mark the space after the Democratic and Republican parties, indicating that the voter is voting for all the candidates of that party. If you want to vote for each person specifically, there are the names of the candidates below, including the presidential candidates of some minor parties, senators, representatives, county officials, etc., that can be distinguished one by one. You can make elaborate choices and vote for Republican candidates and Democratic candidates on the same ballot. This split choice was reflected in the outcome of this election. The final result was that the Republicans won the grand presidential throne, and the Democrats won most of the smaller seats in the House of Representatives. Although these seats are individually smaller than the throne, the cumulative power of these seats is not to be ignored. After the voter fills out the ballot is covered with a cover and sent to the ballot box. This box has an automatic counter to count the number of ballots. After the polls close at 9 p.m. on Saturdays, all ballots are sent to the county government office in charge of elections for counting. The counting process is computerized. From 9 o'clock onwards, television stations report the results of the counties to viewers. On election day, many polling stations are staffed by volunteers. The polling station also has station rules, such as no campaigning at the polling station and no showing of ballots to others, which are posted on the wall for public notice. What are the official duties of each party's headquarters on election day? The activists at each party's headquarters cannot go to the polling stations to promote the election, but each party sends a person who supervises the voting at each polling station. They all have a roster. When each voter comes in to register, the staff tells them. They then mark their roster. This serves two functions. One is to monitor to prevent people from voting twice, and each party has to prevent voters from the other party from cheating. The other is to see if all the voters from their party came to vote. If someone does not come, they will call to show concern. If there are any difficulties, the headquarters of each party to find ways to provide convenience, such as childcare, and so on. This is called canvassing for votes. In the matter of preventing cheating, Americans are wary of others and are less than generous. Measures are taken from the beginning of the grassroots party primaries, such as making it impossible for one person to participate in both parties' primaries by requiring that both parties' primaries be held at the same time. Observers are also assigned to each election station on election day. The counting of votes began after 9 p.m. because there are several time zones in the U.S. mainland. The eastern states were the first to count their votes, and television stations immediately announced the results bit by bit, with the number of votes changing from state to state so viewers could see the results clearly at any time. The presidential election was decided at almost 11 p.m. Central Time, and Bush was elected. The western states, such as California, had just finished voting and the votes had just been counted, so the Westerners were complaining that it was unfair. Because without waiting for their opinions to be expressed, the president had already decided that their votes were useless. This is one of the major drawbacks of the U.S. electoral system, and there are existing proposals for legislation that would establish a time when polling stations across the country would agree to close. Of course, this is under the condition that the votes in the central and eastern states are relatively obvious. If the vote in the central and eastern part of the country is hard to determine, the votes in the west will be pivotal, especially California's votes, because California has a large number of electors and a lot of weight. Presidential elections, I'm afraid, are a little problematic to say the least. There is the Electoral College system in place. Each state awards a portion of the electors. Large states have more, small states have less. The number of voters has no direct impact on the presidential election. Voters affect the direction of the electoral vote within a state. If the Republican Party has a majority in a state, even by the margin of a single vote, all the electoral votes in the state belong to the Republican Party. The implication is that all the votes cast for the Democratic Party in that state are useless. From the final figures, Bush got 47 million votes, accounting for 54% of the total, and Dukakis got 41 million votes, accounting for 46% of the total. The difference is not too big, but when you look at the number of Electoral College votes, the difference is dramatic. Bush received 426 votes, or 79% of the total, while Dukakis received 112 votes, or 21%. Elections are majority rule, and one more person is a majority while the rest are minorities. This political dilemma is still difficult to solve. Do 10 million people have to obey 10,000,001? But to choose a democratic system, you have to accept this reality. This time the minority fails, next time they will fight for this one additional vote or more. After the election results were known, both presidential candidates made speeches. Dukakis said, "I called Vice President Bush a few minutes ago to congratulate him on his victory." Bush said, "I got a call from Governor Dukakis a few minutes ago, and it was sincere, and it's a great tradition in American politics. For those voters who didn't vote for me, I want to be your president too." Both sides thanked the people at their respective headquarters who contributed to the election, their respective families, and their respective running mates. The losing candidate and his supporters also acknowledged the other as president and had no thoughts of contesting the election results and pulling the plug on the other side. The degree to which this system works in an orderly manner is shown here, although the whole mechanism of presidential candidate selection is not accessible to everyone, but in the hands of the parties the final result is the real deal. The party that loses cannot say that it does not accept this reality or that it has other plans. Even if someone wants to, I'm afraid no one will respond. Generally speaking, it is a characteristic of the functioning of a mature system that everyone in society believes that any results of the system's procedural operation cannot be solved by non-procedural means, but only by the procedure itself. If you want to change the outcome, you have to go through the procedure again from the beginning. When to start over again is defined by law. People believe in a procedure, not to bind themselves, but to guard against others, procedures that some people can use to the detriment of others, and that others can use to the detriment of those people. The maturity of the system lies in the continuous effect of this kind of psychology and understanding, and that the society has provided sufficient conditions to ensure the formation and existence of the system. Section 7. Who is in charge? George H.W. Bush was elected the 41st president after 100 battles. Dukakis was also battle-hardened, but was defeated miserably. Why did Bush win? Why did Dukakis lose? This is not only a question of the two presidential candidates, but also a reflection of the election mechanism. It is instructive to analyze the workings of the American political process through the election of Bush as president and the defeat of Dukakis. Richard Stengel, writing in the special election issue of Time magazine, November 21st, 1988, says that there were 9 key moments in the 1988 presidential campaign that determined Bush's victory and Dukakis' defeat. We use this article as a basis for analyzing such an important political process as the presidential election. In the primary stage, Bush campaigned in New Hampshire, where he initially trailed Republican Senator Bob Dole and TV preacher Pat Robertson. Bush immediately acted with urgency, summoning Reagan's favorite speechwriter, Peggy Noonan, to return to New Hampshire with Bush on his official state jet airliner Air Force Two. Noonan worked through the night to draft a speech that would cast Bush's persona in a new light. Meanwhile, mass communications consultant Roger Ailes advocated criticizing Dole, while 2 other public relations consultants opposed it, arguing that it was inappropriate to expose the shortcomings of a fellow Republican. Bush agreed at first. 3 days before the election, Alexander Haig sided with Dole. Polls showed Bush could not win the primary without publishing ads attacking Dole. Bush was still hesitant. Governor John H. Sununu thought it could be published, and Mrs. Bush thought there was no problem. So Bush decided to publish it. They bought all the ad time on Thursday. Dole's team was also meeting on Wednesday and decided not to use any negative ads. Polls showed Dole ahead, so they didn't immediately produce a new ad. When they tried to use the old campaign ads, they were told all the time was full, and it turned out Bush won. If Bush had lost that state primary, where would we be today? With things looking good for Dukakis in the primary, he also met two strong competitors, Al Gore and Jesse Jackson, and Dukakis thought he needed to get the support of New York Mayor Ed Koch. He called Koch. Koch was concerned about Dukakis' attitude toward Jackson, and Dukakis' attitude was uncertain. Koch was against Jackson, so he was not too happy with Dukakis' attitude. In turn, Al Gore's attitude was modest and interesting to Koch, and he chose to support Gore. But Koch's attitude toward Jackson was too intense, and he cursed Jackson at the ceremony to show his support for Gore. Instead, Gore lost support, and Dukakis won. Once the two party candidates were decided, it was a battle between Bush and Dukakis. The initial polls showed Dukakis leading by 10 to 12 points. At this point, Sununu suggested attacking Dukakis' weaknesses: the full universal health insurance plan, the pollution of Boston's harbor, and prison overcrowding. But Bush was a bit hesitant, wanting to wait until the Republican National Convention. But the public surveys showed that if he waited until the Republican Convention, Dukakis would probably be ahead by 20 points. Bush made a snap decision to take an offensive stance. In choosing a running mate, the vice presidential candidate, Dukakis' aides suggested that the person should preferably be from the South, to mirror John F. Kennedy's campaign. Dukakis had a number of candidates, but Dukakis chose Senator Lloyd Millard Benson as a seasoned politician. Within the Democratic Party, there is also competition. Dukakis had to get the support of big players from all sides of the party. Reverend Jesse Jackson is one. Jackson wanted to be the vice presidential candidate, but Dukakis had no such consideration. Since then, Jackson has been trying to work with Dukakis privately, but Dukakis has been feigning ignorance. Jackson then made a stunt out of it. Rich Bond, Dukakis' deputy campaign manager, called Jackson, who whined that Dukakis never consulted him. The problem, Bond said, is that you never explicitly endorsed Dukakis. Jackson was surprised that Bond blaming him for doing too little. His aide suggested he go to the bargaining table, speaking vaguely. Dukakis froze for a moment and hung up the phone, feeling very frustrated. 5 days later, they met again. Jackson was enthusiastic, but it was too late. Bush also had many choices when he chose his vice presidential candidate, such as Jack Kemp, Peter Domenici, Bob Dole, and others. Bush wanted to use this choice to show that he was a man with independent ideas. He had many discussions with senior aide James Baker and others, but no decision was made. He finally chose Dan Quayle. It was a completely personal choice for Bush, and his aides were not sure how to treat this Quayle and how to introduce him to the press. They simply didn't prepare the material for it. The aides felt at their wits' end. Dukakis' campaign organization lacked discipline. John Sasso, his original campaign right-hand man, was sent away for some reason, and they rarely spoke. During the Democratic convention, the two stayed in a hotel, but did not meet. When Dukakis saw that it was not working, he called Sasso, who talked about his ideas, defining a campaign theme, doing a TV campaign, and strengthening the campaign team. But Dukakis couldn't decide again, and it wasn't until August, after his percentages began to fall, that he had to reinstate Sasso. Sasso pulled out all the stops, but the delay had gone on too long. The second televised debate, the most crucial one. In the first televised debate, Dukakis did not do well. But the second was more important, and his aides urged him to fight like Rambo in First Blood. But he had reservations, and finally, Dukakis agreed to his aides' plan and prepared to attack Bush on the following issues: Quayle, Iran-Contra, abortion, patriotism, drugs, and Boston Harbor. On the day of the debate, Dukakis was not feeling well and was ill enough to cancel his 3-hour debate training in the morning. He remained tired and slept in the afternoon and did not get up until 5 o'clock, only an hour before the debate. Half an hour before the debate, another call came in, and Dukakis spoke for 20 minutes. The aide thought that this call prevented Dukakis from concentrating. Less than a minute into the debate, the questioner mentioned a murder case, a topic Dukakis had never prepared for, and only addressed one of the 6 questions he had prepared. The debate was over, and the situation was clear. Bush was feeling bad after the first debate. The next day, Bush asked to be sent a daily memo on the issues to prepare for a rematch. For the first debate, he hired more than a dozen coaches. This one he wanted to do himself, and one day, when the memo didn't arrive, he asked his aides to get it within an hour. Once on Air Force 2, he talked loudly to himself, debating an imaginary Dukakis. Before the debate, Bush's debate coach chatted with him and drew laughs from him to ease his mind. Once Bush got on the stage and saw that Dukakis was very nervous, he got an idea. This is one man's account, which may not be comprehensive and may be sketchy, but it reveals to us a few key aspects of the presidential election. Personnel relationships are critical. Without handling those relationships well, no candidate is likely to win the election. Campaign strategy is also very important. Without an effective campaign strategy, it is impossible to win, and every step and every connection can be a close call. The personalities and abilities of candidates also play a pivotal role in elections, and many voters do not think too much about the complex political issues. They evaluate candidates based on intuition alone. From this process, the election is a real battle within the primaries within both parties and later between the respective candidates of both parties, and must be fought to the hilt. In the presidential election, who is in charge is a complex question. The above material shows that different people at different moments and at different levels all have different roles to play. Of course, only those who have climbed to this level, with the support of the ruling group within the party, have such a problem. The common people have no access to the presidential election and can do nothing about it. After the presidential candidates of both parties have secured the nomination, they face an ocean, and it is a fight to the death as to who will finally reach the other side. He who sinks in the journey across the sea and who can cross it depends on various factors. End of chapter 6.